Welcome to the Watch Reactions channel. If you like 80s digital watches or retro digital watches, you're in the right place. In particular, we're going to be diving deep into the history of Casio during this period. This is part 2 of a series that I've been doing on the rise of Casio. Part 1 covered the 70s to the 80s. Go and check that out if you've not already. This is going to go deep into the 80s. I hope you enjoy the video. If you do enjoy it, please do consider liking, subscribing and leaving a comment below. On my wrist today, I'm still stuck in the 70s. This is my Casio Tron QW04, I believe from around 1975. I do also have my collection of 80s or 80s inspired Casios in the background.
Rubik's Cube, over 3 billion combinations, but just one solution from Ideal.
Throughout the 70s, the cost of a digital module has been driven down over time from $300 to closer to $3. As we enter the 80s, the majority of US and Swiss manufacturers have tapped out of the digital LCD market due to the competition from Japan. And increasingly, Hong Kong and mainland China, they would do the same later to the Japanese manufacturers, most of them leaving the market between the mid-80s and the 90s. Around 1980, Texas Instruments was one of the last major players from the US environment that had a stake in digital watches, and they closed down that division from the early 80s. Let's start our 1980s journey with musical watches. So alarm translated into melody alarms using piezoelectric tone generators with a speaker, which leverages the oscillating quality of quartz, hence crystal sound, with Orient being the first mover in 1979, and Casio, who were diversifying into the musical instrument business with the Casio Tone in the same year, which was their keyboard. They released the Module 82. This is a super fun watch. For example, you can select different dates that will have associated melody tunes. For example, a wedding march for your wedding anniversary, happy birthday on your birthday, jingle bells on Christmas, and different classical and folk songs for different days of the week. The notes flash in different ways, including quite a novel way when you're playing around with the different functions. Later down the track, the musical element would be even more of a focus with the 1985 Melody 30, and other manufacturers took it further with things such as the fun piano watch from Jules in 1987. I talked about the journey towards the calculator watch at length within part 1 of this series, which culminated in Casio's more affordable entry into a previously high-end market, which is a story that pretty much echoes throughout this period of time in digital watches. The calculator is the jumping off point for Casio in the 80s into a lot more other complex forms of computation in wrist form. This mimics the more general developments of the time in computers with IBM, Apple, Microsoft and others that were still in their formative stages. Water resistance has been a focus in the watch field for a long time. Vintage Watch Straps has a great blog on this which goes beyond the oft-quoted Rolex was the first with the oyster narrative, which I recommend that you take a read of. Of course, you have to mention the Rolex and its great publicity stunt that they pulled in 1927, as well as the first watch specifically tested for diving, which was the Omega Marine in 1936. The Blancpain 50 Fathoms and the Rolex Submariner obviously took things on from there, from 90 to 100 meters, and obviously things got more extreme with helium valves and all of that. A series of watches within the digital sphere that carries over this tradition of obsession with greater water resistance is the Marlin series of watches, which is something that Casio collectors love. Obviously so called due to the Marlin picture that they use, although there is some debate about whether this is actually a sailfish you can see on the right hand side of the watch. This particular Marlin has a 100 meters resistance. There seems to be some uncertainty from what I've read between whether the Module 81 or Module 106 was truly the first. We'll come back to this, but you'll notice that the watches in this vein start with a DW, which is Casio code for digital water resistant. There is not any material that I've been able to find, so please put in the comments if you know of one that really goes into the true first on digital watch water resistance. I have seen some 80 Seikos that are 100 meters too around this time, which makes a lot of sense with their diving heritage. The last area for 1980 that I'll get into is the pseudo-analog display, with the Casio Module 103 being a classic within this vein in the 1980s. They were not the first on this, with Suncrux in 1973, Texas Instruments in 1970, and Seiko slightly earlier in 1980 with the watch that was made famous by James Bond in Octopussy. This is very sought after by collectors today. However, Casio did have their own claim to fame with this module, although the film did actually come out in 1983, which was that Roy Schneider wore it in Blue Thunder with a central role in this scene. Casio are one of the most abundant producers of gaming-related watches, and were amongst the earliest to move into the field with games embedded into calculators, as well as more specific game watches. Google it for some really crazy ones. But if we're to believe a Polygon article, which was called A Visual Guide to Watch Gaming's 40 Years History, then after Mattel's handheld games, the Monte Carlo watch by Unirex in 1977 was possibly the first example, with a slot machine from the Meister Anker group being another. At the same time as Casio's first foray, we also see the Nintendo Game & Watch, with Ball being the first in the series in 1980. Casio's own game watches were the GM10 and GM20, which were the UFO interceptor game. Now you could do a whole video on this huge rabbit hole and go and check some crazy examples. For example, I've seen the Tortoise F1, Moonfight Robot, and Egg Panic, amongst many others. If you're interested in the genre, Nelsonic's deal to do Pac-Man and later Nintendo to do the game watches on the Mario Brothers series, Zelda and others is something you should definitely look into. The next interesting move from Casio we can see is within the popular activity of jogging, which had been mainstream during the 1970s during the so-called US running boom, which is often credited to Frank Shorter's marathon win in the 1972 Olympics, with President Jimmy Carter and many millions of Americans getting in on the act that was previously considered to be a bit weird. A Sports Illustrated article suggests that the F-100, Casio's first plastic watch, infamous for its modified version worn by Ripley in Alien, was positioned by Casio as a jogging watch, which makes sense with it being lightweight, but the innovation was with the Pace Runner, which is where you could set a pace of intermittent beeps from 1 being very slow to 69 being crazy fast, which would help you time your run, hence it being known as the Coach. Strangely enough, it featured a calculator, which was a bit of a bizarre choice, but I suppose why not? Famously, Sting wore this watch, which is a mandatory reference when this is brought up. This is one in the line of many jogging watches from Casio, with the famous Running Man graphic arriving the following year that is very sought after by collectors.
Everyone else talks about the revolution that's coming. You can experience the revolution that's here.
It's in this period when I noticed more anime-style graphics and cartoons making its way into some of the designs at Casio, which showed a willingness to adopt popular culture within its models, alongside its sporty, and I suppose also geeky brand. In the research for this video, one from 1982 that popped out to me was this cool Megaforce model, tied into the Megaforce film released in the same year. On the more cutesy end of the spectrum is this Hanna-Barbera watch, and if you dig, you can find all sorts of this style of cartoon Casio watch at very high prices on eBay. I mentioned the sporty image. Well, these basketball watches were indicative of the continued game watch line that continued throughout the 80s. Crazy sensor watches really started to kick on in the 80s, with one of the earliest examples of this type of watch from Casio being a focus on temperature. Now, according to Peter Doneson, as always one of my main sources, this goes back to the Mortimer model from 1956, but my absolute favourite is the totally iconic Ana Digi Temp by Citizen, which they launched in 1982, which is still going strong today with the recently released Star Wars models, which you should check out. Casios do actually look a bit boring in comparison, but this is still a very important milestone in their story, and these are the T1000 and the T2000 that use module 215. You can see the very clear display showing the temperature at the top of the screen. Now, I'm going to be a little bit naughty and skip the chronology here, as I'm not going to come back to temperature so much, but I wanted to reference this really cool fact that this 1985 temperature model which used module 515, looks as if it was actually worn by Ayrton Senna if you were to believe this Watch You Seek thread that I've linked here. This could be a fun one to chase on eBay if you're a motorsports fan, because I'm not sure that this one's particularly widely known. I've not focused on this loads, but it is worth noting that Casio's continued advancement of the calculator watch carried on across the decade, and this includes this very complicated looking CFX20 scientific calculator, although note that this had actually been done quite a while before, which you can see in my other video on this topic in part 1. We'll come back to the full nerdiness that is the Databank later, which you can drown in the details of, but in 1982 it's worth noting the cool TE 2500 dictionary watch, which could both translate between English and Japanese, and also save phrases in multiple languages. This was obviously an important milestone in watches with memory and a database line as distinct from pure calculators. Of course, Seiko was there first with the LCD digital quartz memory bank in 1978 and the Memo watch in 1982 that could store 24 digits. So remember I mentioned those fun Marlin watches that were focused on water resistance at the start? Well, this focus on sporty watches and the water resistance that comes with that continued into watches targeted at swimmers. These ones on screen are from 1981. But we get truly heavy duty with the Snorkeler watch, which advanced things to 200 meters with the resin case, which you'll note is strikingly similar to another watch from Casio that would come out in 1983.
The saga lives on. Return of the Jedi, rated PG. Now playing at a theater in your galaxy.
An interesting technology that Casio began to commercialize in 1983 was touchscreen technology, which of course we all now use on our Apple Watches today. As we're seeing is often the case, Casio wasn't the first here, but rather it was the Omega sensor in 1980, which contained a microprocessor and was able to recognise the touch of a finger. See this video from YouTube that I've linked the source of. Casio's move in this space was in the context of calculators with the TC50 touch sensor, which was the 119 and 120 modules. If we jump forward a couple of years to 1984, you can see the gestures touchscreen on this Ana Digi model, the so-called Janus touchscreen, and this is on a video on Chrome FD's YouTube channel. Of course, 1983 is the year where the ability of digital watches to withstand harsh conditions became front and centre. Although perhaps delayed until the successful ice hockey advert, which was with a slightly later model, this was obviously the driver for success for Casio up until the present day. This is of course well-trodden history, which others elsewhere have covered much better than me, so I'll just cover it in passing. Beyond this initial model, however, is an interesting one that I wanted to pull out here, which was the wide temp LC model, which ditched the backlight and focused on the ability to withstand large variations in temperature, which is an angle that Casio would use within its positioning within winter sports watches, which you can see in this classic catalogue. The final angle for 1983 that I thought would be interesting to look at is Casio's first release of a solar LCD watch. Now, the initial research into selenium that enabled this technology was in the 1920s and 30s, with this being used in a clock for the first time by Patek Philippe in 1953 at the Basel Fair. In 1973, the funky-looking Synchronar 2100 of Real Electronics utilised solar in an LED watch, and Crystallonic used it within the LCD context in 1976, from Germany for a change. Seiko was again the first Japanese mover in 1978 with the A156, and therefore Casio was a little bit late to the party in 1983 with the SA60G, which used the 189 module. This was one of the few I was able to find that Casio released in the 80s actually. Of course, being Casio, this all came over to the calculator watch in the same year through the module 243 in the CL301. This is jumping forward because I don't want to come back to the topic. It's worth mentioning the 1986 so-called batteryless FB50 with the module 520. Later there would be all sorts of different proprietary technologies for different solar watches, which include Sanyo and Panasonic's Immortan, of which I own a cool table clock version from 1987, which I found an excuse to bring into this video, Citizen's Eco Drive model, and of course Casio's own Tough Solar, amongst others. So something I wanted to know about 1984 was kind of the refocusing of Timex, who has kind of had this ongoing battle with Casio over this period of time. They'd been having some dabbles up until this point in the computer field in a collaboration with Sinclair, but competition from Commodore really kind of pushed them out of that environment, and they really doubled down around this period on the watch side of their business. Trying to come back at Casio had really taken a bite out of their US market share at this point, and they did this by really focusing in on sport watches in particular and athletes associated with the triathlon, which they'd been sponsoring, and that resulted in the Timex Triathlon, which later changed over to the Timex Ironman. It became a best-selling watch in the US, especially as we got into the 90s and the launch of Indiglo, which I think we'll come back to in part 3 of this series. But back to Casio. Like Van Halen themselves, 1984 brought with it some pretty over-the-top bells and whistles to some watches that we've already looked at. So the wake-up watch with an extra speaker for the alarm, with the alarm on steroids. The calculator was extended to 10 digits. But the real focus in 1984 was when Casio took the step from the original dictionary watch to the Databank series. So the first Databank model was the CD401, which used module 246. The Casio website refers to this as an information device on the wrist, and beyond its calculator capability, it can save 10 groups of 16 numbers or letters, with this enabling you to save people's phone numbers rather than carrying them around on an organiser. Later in the same year, the Telememo 50 allowed 50 different groups of 6 letters and 12 numerals, making it much more of a bank. So making the true link with computers, Seiko took the next step, which is where it could be connected to a computer, with the RC1000, which enabled more storage, and the RC2000, also in 1984, could be clipped onto a keyboard so that you could fill it with 2,000 characters and even some games, which was the real true coming together of watch and computer. Now we've gone into a lot about some of the milestones of digital watch and Casio development, but it's also important to remember that it's just cool looking fashion watches that were also a big part of Casio's more mainstream appeal in the 1980s. One that is particularly eye-catching and sought after today is the F-15, which uses the 350 module, with the printed straps really making it fit the cool vibe. The Rally BMX F78W is another very cool looking one, and you can see them both in this old school cartoon ad. A slightly different angle is the thinness of watches, and this is obviously a whole area of pursuit within the mechanical world, which is a rabbit hole that you can go down. There isn't a huge amount I've been able to find on the technology, but to get both the band and the watch in one piece, they used a hybrid of plastics moulding and microelectronics to achieve this ultra-thin film watch known as the Pella FS10, which came in a whole variety of flavours, one of which I own personally. A final thing to mention is Casio bumping up to the true heavy-duty water resistance with 300 metres now, with this being known for obvious reasons as the tank.
I feel the need for speed.
In 1986, from what I can see, things start getting a bit more colourful and fashion-focused for Casio. This dot matrix LCD FS12 I thought was nice, and the What's New series shows the variety of different colours that would now be made available for the same underlying module, similar to what we see with G-Shock squares today. Two cool watches I wanted to call out here were the F23W with the sporty casual strap. This one is actually mine, unfortunately it doesn't have the original strap. Another fun reference is the DW71, which was actually worn by Napoleon Dynamite, which I thought was nicely casted. Building on from the pseudo-analog watches we discussed earlier, 1986 saw the introduction of the very cool looking twin graph, so called because of the two different pseudo-analog LCD displays. We'll come back to the version of this on steroids later. We can see Casio scraping the barrel for ideas to use for these sorts of displays, with a fun example being this soccer time, which was specifically designed for referees. With the page showing some other of the super specific sports watches for motorsports, and even a tennis coach, one for Russell I think from the Mad Watch Collector channel perhaps. The collector's favourite, the Running Man, was still going strong in 1986, but this year saw the introduction of the calorie counting element in the jog and walk calorie, and things got even fancier with the lap memory watch marketed as a digital training diary you wear on your wrist. Outside of these sports and fashion focused watches, the next phase of the sensor range of watches beyond just temperature started with a depth gauge watch. So the history of depth gauges goes way back to the Turtle submarine in 1775, where the clockmaker Isaac Doolittle integrated a depth gauge into the first submarine used in warfare. Mechanical watches actually have a fun history of depth gauges, with a good source being an article on monochrome, which includes examples such as the Fabra Luber from the 1960s, and I thought that this one with the G-Shock was quite fun. Of course, this has already been done by dive computers in the 1980s, with this Orca Edge being one of the first available, and this Aladdin watch being more specifically made for this task. However, for us non-specialist folks, the Casio depth gauge was fun, and this was a precursor to things like the G-Shock Frogman, which would be launched later in 1993. For 1987, I wanted to cover more of a novelty area with the radio watch, as well as a more classic complication in the world time. A radio strapped to a watch actually goes back to at least 1967, with an example from Continental Telephone Supply Co. You can see an advert on the screen for this. Cheap radio watches were actually very widely available and largely made in Hong Kong, with examples like the one you can see now. A fun example of these being popularised and a suitably 80s reference for this video is David Hasselhoff in Knight Rider, who uses one of these to communicate with Kit the car. Time's Ticking did a fun video on this, which also brought to my attention that Knight Rider wasn't the only instance of this kind of watch, with Dick Tracy also being a famous user of such a gadget. Fun, retro-looking examples of such watches became available. I think this may be one from Sinclair, and Citizen also had this fun yellow model. Casio's own foray into this field was the TM100 FM voice transmitter. What kid wouldn't want one of these in 1987? In related fun, the phone dialer is a pretty mad watch from Casio. This used DTMF or dual tone multi-frequency, and if you hold it up to a phone with a dial tone and mute the tone, this emanates out these DTMF tones and makes the phone actually dial the number, as you can see in this video. We all know about the Casio Royale and its fun display of the world map, but one of the earlier versions of this way of displaying the world time with a highlighted part of the world map is from Seiko. This is one of Casio's first actual watches to have this feature as part of an LCD display. So what's going on for Casio in 1988? Before we do anything, I think we have to shout out Module 590, released in 1988, which was used for the classic W59. I love this watch. Remember we said before about all of those random sports with their own timers? Well, this watch sees all of those wrapped up into just one with the sports multi-timer. Building on the depth gauge advancement we talked about before, Casio built on the long history of altimeters Originally starting with equipment for aeroplanes with Colsman's original designs, Casio brought this together in the alti-depth watch. Something I found particularly interesting in the research for this video has been the history of watches for measuring pulse. You could see I was digging deep with the reference to physicians' pulse watches from way back in the day. Physicians' pulse watches existing in both pocket watch forms like the one on screen, and some very attractive models from big brands like Longines, with this reissue being a particularly nice looking one that replicates that style from the 1920s. In the digital watch domain, it seems almost inevitable that Pulsar would be one of the first, with this being a very rare model that was released in gold and later in steel. You can see this schematic from the excellent old Pulsar's website on how this all works. Seiko, with this awesomely 80s looking version, and Citizen had their own models, and Casio really leaned into the fitness craze with its advertisements for the pulse check. How 80s can you get, I think, on this particular one. The use of multiple graphical LCD displays continued with another twin graph. I've included this one because it was worn by Doctor Who, and 1988 also saw the release of the trigraph model. This one's actually mine. It was worn by Jake Gyllenhaal in Donnie Darko, very cool on the side of his wrist style, and a fellow Instagrammer nicknamed it The Donnie, so if you do get one, get that hashtag going.
Introducing Game Boy. It's portable, it's in stereo, and its games are interchangeable. Plus, Game Boy comes with the outrageous new game, Tetris.
So we move into our final year. What else could Casio bring us in 1989? Although the module was developed earlier, the release of the F91W module in 1989 can't go without mention, as it's probably the most ubiquitous Casio watch that there is. Go down to Argos now and you can get one for about £10. The map meter is a fun one. It has a wheel that you physically roll across a map, and the watch can convert this into real distance. The Cosmo phase had information on all of the planets and the stars, and the moon graph replicated one of the highest end complications within the humble digital watch. Just look at this original catalogue from the time showing all of these cool watches. Display of tides was possible for fishermen. A calorie pedometer continued to build in functionality for the health conscious, which foreshadowed the Fitbits and smartwatches of today, with the last watch that I'll mention being the suitably mad and Casio-like UV sensor. So that is my run through of Casio's journey through the 80s, with a few segues along the way that I hope you enjoyed. I look forward to getting stuck into the research for what I think will be the final part of this series, Casios in the 90s. So that's all for today's video. I do hope that you enjoyed it. I enjoyed the research that went into it. If you enjoyed it, please do consider liking and subscribing, and I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day.